This is a Sustainable Today special presentation.
The way we're living now is as if we don't belong here. We can reinvent ourselves to be the kind of human beings that actually do belong here by living like we belong here. I visited these 14 eco-villages on 5 continents. I selected intentionally for success. This is what I found, that these are the core kind of attitudes unifying people in all of those places. Rather than going against the thing that they oppose, they are primarily trying to go towards the thing that they're for. They are changing the game. There are ways of living as human beings on the planet that could really work. If you want to kind of get a bigger picture perspective on what's happening and how we might live together on this planet, I think maybe I have something to offer you.
Our world is an amazing, complex living organism, and we coexist in a symbiotic relationship. With this great power comes a great responsibility, a responsibility to ensure the future by taking steps to be sustainable today.
I teach international environmental politics at the University of Washington. I've been on the faculty there since 1991. And in a nutshell, what's happened is I wrote books on treaties and sovereignty, and I looked at remote sensing technologies and global environmental monitoring. And as I'm looking at these top-down solutions, it becomes more and more obvious to me that they aren't really doing the job. And I think we now see that really in spades with respect to climate change, and we really see it across the board. And so I began to think, well, it seems to me that there are ways of living as human beings on the planet that could really work. We have technological expertise, we have the science, we're good-hearted, we have democratic institutions to some extent, we have global communications, we have so much, and yet we are aware more and more so that our ways of living on this planet are unraveling the planetary life support systems. As the book outlines in the beginning, I just got really tired of making my students so depressed and frustrated and angry, and I felt that I needed to give them something more positive, and I also needed to find it myself. And so after about 15 years of teaching international environmental law and politics, I decided to find the people who were really living planetary interdependence and not just talking about it. I began to do some work on what I call Gaian governance, which is basically looking at the Earth as a living system and then asking ourselves, what would it take to live within the carrying capacity of that living system? And then I became very curious, is anybody out there trying to do that? And so the examples that I found that were the most integrated and the most hands-on and the deepest, I would say, at the level of everyday life were eco-villages. So I went around the world looking at communities on 5 continents, many of them intentional communities, and many of them also traditional rural villages in the global south that are trying to integrate eco-village principles. What I found was very inspiring, but I won't entirely be a cheerleader for eco-villages because there are certainly problems as well. And I'm not really an eco-village person. I'm really a global environmental politics person. So I'm very interested in how do we scale up these lessons to larger and larger scales. If you want to kind of get a bigger picture perspective on what's happening and how we might live together on this planet, I think maybe I have something to offer you. And certainly I have a lot of pretty slides because some of these places are very beautiful. So I organized the book into 4 core chapters: ecology, economics, community, and consciousness, which I call E2C2. Because I think that this is a way of looking at any human endeavor, really. It's a nice kind of analytical model, but it's also a way of looking at the different aspects of ecovillages and how they interpenetrate. So how do those aspects interfuse? So for instance, if we trust each other more, how much more are we willing to share on the material plane? Right? That's a really good question. And one of the things that happens in ecovillages is that they are very much able to shrink their ecological footprint, in part because there's a higher degree of trust, and so therefore a higher degree of material sharing. One of the things I think that ecovillages are doing is that they are changing the game. They're trying to change the game. And when I say that, what I mean is the game. What is the game? The game is kind of the social purpose of any social system. The game that we've got is this resource extractive linear economy. This graph, we all know this graph, it's a graph of exponential growth, of population, of consumption, of you name it. And it's an unsustainable game on a finite planet. It's not going to last. When you enter a game to win, what will happen when you win? What happens to the game when you win the game? It's over. End of game, right? And you have a winner and a loser, usually. That's the end of the game. And maybe a team wins, and so it's not just you as an individual. So it's more cooperative. But still, there's a winner and there's the end of the game. What happens when you play a game in order to keep the game going? It's a different kind of game. We are living in a growth economy, and it has a goal. You could say it has a goal. Its goal is growth, and growth in material wealth, growth in economic wealth. That is not a sustainable game. We know that we're overstretching the Earth's carrying capacity. We know that the ecological footprint of the average American lifestyle is 6 Earths, and we only have one. So sustainability really is an infinite game. It doesn't mean that literally the Earth will last forever, but if human civilization lasted for 100,000 years, that would be a long time, you know? So we can't really work in these time frames, but we can begin getting this concept of playing in order to keep the game going. And that means playing with life in that way, as opposed to the way that we're playing it now. In the overview, that's what ecovillages are up to. They're trying to play an infinite game. Think about it in terms of your own life. If you, say, entered a relationship, an intimate relationship, and you came with the objective of winning, how do you think it's going to go? It's like, it's not going to go so well. It will probably, like all finite games, it will end. But if you play in order to keep it going, it doesn't mean it'll go on forever, but it'll be a different quality of game that you're playing. You see? And we in our society, we're sort of we're partly hardwired to be going for the winning game, and we're also partly hardwired for the connective, relational, more sustainable game. So I think that's the choice that we're up to right now. And they're changing the game by changing the story. I visited these 14 ecovillages on 5 continents. I selected intentionally for success the communities that would be the most viable in terms of their social relationships, in terms of their actual ability to live more ecologically sustainable, the communities that were known for being models. I visited those communities intentionally because I was looking for success. But across that, I visited a tremendous diversity. I visited rich and poor countries, rich and poor ecovillages, high and low-tech ecovillages. I visited religious, spiritual, and secular ecovillages. I visited rural and urban and suburban. And so across all this diversity, Africa, Sri Lanka, India, several countries in Europe, North America, Australia, and across this diversity, I interviewed 150 different people, and this is what I found, that these are the core kind of attitudes unifying people in all of those places. One is that the web of life is sacred and that we are actually an integral part of that web, that we are actually not separate from that. And that the way you reweave the web of life is to take an integrative approach to sustainability. So that's the thing about eco-villages, is that they're not just focused on ecological or even just social sustainability. They're also looking at economic sustainability, and they're looking at how do we develop the kind of consciousness that makes us into the kind of human beings that can live this way. And a very strong commitment to the idea that positive change will mostly come from the bottom up. And that does not mean that they completely remove themselves from the rest of society. They're very much engaged. Overall, eco-villagers are more politically active than the mainstream public by far. But it does mean that they have more confidence in the bottom-up approach, and starting at the household and community level. Eco-villages are very deeply involved at the global level. Many of them have international relations with other eco-villages, sister eco-villages between the global north and global south. They are active, very active on climate change issues, genetically modified food, many international issues, and local political issues as well. So they're not enclaves, they're not isolated. And they go for what I call a do-it-yourself politics of yes. Rather than going against the thing that they oppose, they are primarily trying to go towards the thing that they're for. So very often, because academics like to dichotomize, they dismiss eco-villages as lifestyle politics. But it's not true. That's not what I found at all. Eco-villagers are by far more politically active than the general population. And that's really worth paying attention to. So it's not an either-or thing. Living your values does not mean that you are politically irrelevant. We are actually drawn to the thing that we love more so than we hate the thing that we don't want. You know? So when we think of politics, politics is very often about protest or about trying to persuade a leader to do the right thing, a representative. And that's all fine, but we also can just live what we want. And I think that's what eco-villages are doing very beautifully. And in doing all of this, you are transformed. And so anybody who's lived in community knows that it's really tough, and you'll change. You'll just get changed by it. Diana Leaf Christian says, community is the longest, most expensive personal growth workshop you'll ever take. And judging from the people I interviewed, I think that's right. So they're changing the story from hyper-individualism to the story that we are actually not separate from the rest of nature. And even more subtle perhaps, but very important, if that's true, then we can access the evolutionary intelligence that brought us here. I show a lot of political cartoons in my big classes. I teach global environmental politics to classes with as many as 300 students. And so I have to find ways of kind of making it a little more entertaining. And you get a kind of dark sense of humor when you teach this stuff, right? So one cartoon that I show is the eco depth gauge. How deep is your ecology? So you all familiar with deep ecology? You've heard of this? So shallow ecology is the earth is a good tool and we should treat it like we would treat any good tool, you know. And it gets even deeper, you know, wilderness should be preserved for its own sake. The deepest, however, is that human beings are a blight upon the planet, and a painful extinction is the only just solution. And what I love about this is that this is put out by a deep ecology magazine. So they're clearly making fun of themselves. But you know, there's something about that where we feel, to be a human being is to not belong here, you know, or to be acting like we don't belong here. So anyway, the story that eco-villagers are telling is that we do belong here. So they take it upon themselves and then they try to model it. And they take those models even into protest. So for instance, one of the things that communities in Europe do when the G20 summit happens, used to be G8, but they've been doing it for many years, they create a model eco-village right outside of the summit. And they say, look at what the world could be, how we could be living. So they're protesting, but they're showing an alternative at the same time. It's wonderful, actually. So I say sustainability is an inside job. And what I mean by that is that we have to change ourselves. We have to integrate ourselves. So the way we're living now is as if we don't belong here, if you think about it. But we can reinvent ourselves to be the kind of human beings that actually do belong here by living like we belong here, which is changing the story and living that story. So the new story is a story beyond hyper-individualism. This is from Findhorn in northern Scotland. And the idea that if we are inseparable from nature, then that means that we can contact the evolutionary intelligence that brought us here, right? And so there's many ways of going about doing that. For some communities, it's more like organizing themselves around permaculture principles. So you observe nature, you see how does it work. Oh, okay, well, we organize ourselves along those principles. For some, it's more mystical. You know, some are communicating with plants, for instance. And some are meditating and doing collective processes around that. Some are just watching the land and observing and taking note. Some are really studying systems theory and applying it in their communities. These are people who are very committed. And I actually had some reservation about going in and doing this book because I was taking them away from their lives in order to do this. One of the sad things, I'm going to just say this because this is an academic audience, is that it's very clear that they are radically, for the most part, in affluent countries, reducing their ecological footprints. But for the most part, they're not measuring it. They don't have time. I would say that there are many eco-villages in the affluent world that are living somewhere between 10% and 50% of their home country average footprint. That's pretty impressive. And the 50% one would be something like EcoVillage at Ithaca, which is a middle-class suburban eco-village. So I'll show you some of the communities. Let's get to the pictures. This is a photograph of the living machine at Findhorn. This is an old one. They have newer ones that are much more efficient, but this was built in the 90s. This recycles the water for the entire community for 600 people. Turns out clean water that they say is probably drinkable, but the health department says not to drink it, through reed-based and plant-based filtration. And so part of the principles, one of the principles in eco-villages is recycling everything, not just recycling your garbage, which actually very often doesn't get recycled, but truly recycling. So every community that I visited has rainwater catchment, for instance. And some are very strongly dependent upon rainwater catchment. And almost every community I visited had some form of wastewater treatment like this. In the warmer countries, like in India and Sri Lanka, where I was, you don't have to have a greenhouse, and the biotic activity happens much faster, and so it's much simpler and much more low-tech than this. Part of the thing I want to show you in this slideshow, because it's universal, is just the beauty of some of this stuff. So, you know, beyond the mathematical measurement of what's the footprint, how does it feel to be in these places? And so I want you to just kind of get a sense of this. So this is Findhorn in northern Scotland. It started out as a spiritual, mystical community where these three Christian mystics after World War II trying to figure out how do we kind of reconstruct our culture in the aftermath of the war, and meditating and praying, and knew nothing about ecology, had never gardened at all, and the guidance that they got was to make compost. So literally, they got guidance in their meditation for how to make compost, and they built soil, and then they also supposedly learned how to talk to plants and communicate with vegetables and fruits and learn how to grow them from the plants themselves. And they grew phenomenal things. This was in the late 60s, early 70s. They were growing strawberries the size of tomatoes, and they were growing tomatoes the size of grapefruits, like huge, huge food. And this was documented. It was on BBC. It was like a big thing. So people, hippies mostly, from all over the Western world started gravitating towards northern Scotland. And it became a really large community. Quite impressive, really. The founders eventually left, although one of them, who's now in her late 80s, has returned. And one of their mottos is attuned to earth, attuned to spirit. So much of what they try to do is integrating earth and spirit. So this is a little chapel that they have where they do meditation and teze singing in the morning. It's bermed into the hillside, so it's only kind of, it's got this front face, but the rest of it's in the hill. It's all from natural materials on the land, so rock and wood and soil from the land. And it's a beautiful little structure. It's very well insulated. You do need a heater there in the winter, but it's still, you know, it's lovely to sit in there and sing. So this is the kind of feeling that you might get. So Findhorn was known for growing food and vegetables and this sort of thing, but eventually, because so many people came and wanted to learn, they developed what I call a conference economy. So they now grow people in the form of workshops and conferences, mostly on spiritual and ecological themes. And this is wonderful. Maybe 10,000 people a year come to their events. That happens in the Universal Hall. It's this very beautiful building, round theater kind of thing. And they teach a lot of kind of social, relational skills for how to be in community. They also have developed some businesses that are consultancies that bring Findhorn's people skills into the corporate world, for instance. A friend of mine was just last month meeting with Microsoft and Boeing executives to bring Findhorn practices into their workplaces. So you see, they have a ripple effect. And it's interesting because Findhorn was one of these communities that in the 60s and 70s was called a cult by the mainstream and particularly the locals. And now those same people are going to those communities and getting advice about how to treat their water systems and how to get along together. But this conference economy, as wonderful as it is dependent upon jet fuel. And they know it. So Findhorn is one of the few eco-villages that has measured its ecological footprint, and it's about a quarter to a third of the British footprint, which is pretty darn good, which is already significantly lower than ours. But if you included the jet travel, it would be really high. And they're quite aware of this irony. And there's discussion about it. So for instance, one meditation teacher there told me, well, I'm not really concerned about it because if it's your soul's destiny to realize itself in this lifetime, you'll stop at nothing. And I was like, oh, really? Well, maybe there's some truth to that. I don't know. Whereas there are people in Findhorn who feel, you know, that they really need to relocalize the economy. They really need to be getting the conference economy much more online and not so much people jetting to Findhorn. So here's another community. This is in the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina, Earth Haven. This is a rural community as well as Findhorn is, and it's, they have pioneered a form of natural building that is not just about earth and, you know, sand and straw, but is also stick framing with second growth poplar from their forest. So they have 320 acres of second growth forest, and they're trying to find ways of working with that forest sustainably. So they have a sustainable forestry collective, and they have a sustainable building company that builds homes like this. And in some of the neighborhoods in Earth Haven, this is a community with now about 70 people. And some of them actually build their own homes as individuals or as families. This is, I think, a sixplex, and this is quite typical of the kinds of buildings that they have. They feel really good. They're strongly passive solar and more passive house. And you know, your body says yes to being in these kinds of places. And this is a house that's being built in more of a communitarian way with slip straw and you know, with cob and some stick framing as well. I want to say a little bit about Earth Haven here, actually. So one of the questions that people ask is, how do people make decisions in eco-villages? When you get 50 to 300 people together, how do you make decisions? Well, the conventional model, at least in the global north, is consensus decision making. And most of the time, it actually works surprisingly well. But sometimes it really breaks down. And when I was visiting Earth Haven, their consensus model had really broken down, because there were people there who felt that they're living in the forest and trees should not be cut down, which means no farming, right? And so there's like this tension, farming versus forests, right? Both good ecological things that you want to be doing, you know. And then another issue that came up was water. So in order to be able to bring people in for workshops and conferences, not on the scale of Findhorn, much smaller scale, but still people, there's a learning center at Earth Haven. They needed to be able to have more water. And so running their water system only on rainwater catchment was not sufficient, nor farming. They needed to be able to have wells. So digging for water. And some people in the community felt that that was wrong, that that was unsustainable, that that was violating, they said, Mother Earth. And so people ask, well, what do eco-villagers argue about? Well, I'd say the main thing they argue about is sustainability.